I woke up. The smell of antiseptic. I tried to move my feet. Nothing. The doctor said, "I'm sorry. Permanent paralysis." But the voice that broke me was my husband's. Ricardo leaned in, and his whisper was cold as steel. "Clara is dead, Helena, and you are the killer." I'm Helena Duarte. I was a healer. My hands restored movement to broken bodies. Now I can't even turn over in bed. Ricardo, Dr. Ricardo Duarte, the district attorney, told the jury that I had a seizure, that I fell down the stairs, after to kill her, and he had the proof. But why would he do this to me? The first sound of my new life was the creak of my chair wheels on the cold prison cement. The cell is damp. The smell of iron and despair clung to my skin. For 5 years this prison has been my penance. The loss of my legs, the loss from my best friend, I accepted her as mine justice. I accepted the silence and toe blame. Mass betrayal is a wound that does not heal. And today the silence was broken. A letter. A nurse who kept a secret for years. A recording. They think they destroyed me. They think a paralyzed woman can't do anything. But they forgot. The real freedom. It's not in the legs. It's in the mind. And mine now only thinks about redemption. That hospital was my first prison. The smell of bleach and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor were the soundtrack to my confusion. Thessalence of my body was the highest. There was a terrible emptiness, a disconnect below my waist, an itch on the sole of my left foot that I could never scratch. The lawsuit wasn't an abstract idea. It was a new physical reality, a geography of myself that had been wiped off the map. The light streaming through the window was white and cold, and it seemed to judge my immobility. I was in a cocoon of gauze and tubes, and the only thing connecting me to my former world was the man sitting beside the bed, holding my hand. The man I loved. He was my anchor, and I was drowning. Ricardo didn't look like a grieving husband. He looked like a prosecutor preparing for court. His eyes, which I knew as warm and full of life, were now calculating, opaque. He brought me lilies, funeral flowers. He told me the story, his voice perfectly calibrated with pain, that Clara, my best friend, my soul sister, and I had a terrible fight over something I couldn't remember, that I was crazy, out of my mind, that I pushed her. And then, in a fit of remorse and panic, I fell down our grand marble staircase myself. "I tried to save you, Helena," he said, his voice cracking with practiced perfection. "But I was too late for her, and almost too late for you." He wept, but his tears felt cold. I tried to remember. There was a black hole where memory should have been. The physical pain was a white roar. The painkillers kept me in a chemical fog, and the trauma was a wall. In the midst of this fog, his voice was my only voice. True. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? I cried for loss of Clara. I cried for loss of my legs, and wept for the burden I had become to him. But something was wrong. In his grief, there was no pain. There was finality. There was an order that was almost professional. The prison didn't start with the bars. It started in that sterile room, where his lie became my reality and betrayal wore the mask of compassion. He held my hand as he sentenced me. The courtroom was a blur of polished mahogany and the odors of dust and public sweat. The sound of my wheelchair on the linoleum floor sounded like a scream in the silence oppressor of the room. I was a spectacle. The broken assassin. Thelos. The stripping of my dignity was absolute, each camera flash stealing another piece of the woman I once was. I felt like a caged animal, exposed to the public's moralistic judgment. They didn't see a woman in mourning. They saw a monster deserving of punishment. The cold light of the courtroom seemed to expose my every flaw, real or imagined, illuminating the shame Ricardo had painted on me. The reporters' buzzing was like flies on a carcass, and I was the carcass. Ricardo was the star of the prosecution. He took the pulpit, not as my husband, but as Clara's avenger, the bastion of justice. He wept. He told the jury about my hidden instability, about an envy I supposedly harbored for Clara, an envy so corrosive it drove me to violence. He presented my own words, twisted and taken out of context. Emails about professional frustrations became veiled threats. A diary entry about feeling trapped in my life, a metaphorical reflection on routine, was presented as the harbinger of a psychotic break. She already felt caged, he told the jury, his voice thick with false sadness. I just didn't know she was capable of destroying the person who tried hardest to free her. My lawyer, an overwhelmed public defender visibly intimidated by Ricardo's reputation, could barely muster a defense. He looked at me with pity, not conviction. He saw me as Ricardo saw me, a lost cause. Every objection he attempted to raise was crushed by Ricardo's superior rhetoric. The judge seemed mesmerized by the prosecutor's performance. The prosecution presented photos of the crime scene, Clara's body, and then photos of my fall. The narrative was perfect, a crime of passion followed by a failed and poetically tragic suicide attempt. Betrayal. It wasn't just personal. It was professional. It was legal. He was using the full weight of the law to crush me. I watched all of this in a state of dissociation. It was like watching a movie about someone else's life. This man, performing his pain for the jury, was not the man I'd shared a bed with for 12 years. He wasn't the man I'd made coffee for every morning. Betrayal was so complete, so artfully executed, that it paralyzed my mind as much as my body. The guilty verdict was a mere formality. The silence that fell upon the room as the jury returned was heavy, suffocating. The sound of the judge's gavel was not a blow, it was the silence, and it was the sound of Ricardo's key turning in the lock, locking me inside his lie. And worst of all, part of me believed it was justice. Only later did I realize the real trial had not yet begun. Arriving at the prison was a descent into sensory hell. The smell of cheap disinfectant, mildew, and stale sweat hit me like a physical wall. The sound was a cacophony. Metal doors slamming with a final echo. High-pitched screams echoing through the cement corridors. And the constant hum of fluorescent lighting. A cold white light that never seemed to truly go out. Processing was the deepest humiliation. I had to be stripped naked by 2 female guards who handled me with brutal, disinterested efficiency, their cold eyes examining my paralysis as if it were a defect in a piece of furniture. "You don't know where to sit," one of them sneered at another newcomer, but the comment seemed directed at me. I was less than human. I was a logistical problem, an inconvenient burden. They gave me an orange uniform, the fabric rough against my skin, and took me to Pod 3B, the medical wing. My special cell was a little bigger to accommodate the chair, but the smell was the same. The iron was cold. A woman in a nearby bed, her face lined with years of addiction, watched me insolence. Her eyes held no judgment, no pity. They held the emptiness of acceptance. "The first day is always the worst," she murmured, before turning to the wall. "Here, you either learn quickly or become someone else's lesson." Her advice hung in the heavy air, a simple, brutal truth. The cell wasn't a room. It was a concrete box designed to contain not just bodies, but despair. The walls were peeling, with names scratched in with fingernails, silent testaments of women who had been there before me. I dragged myself to the small, polished steel mirror on the wall. The reflection that stared back at me was that of a stranger. Sunken eyes, pale skin, matted hair. A fractured woman. Loss it was total. Freedom, I realized, was never about the ability to walk. It was about the belief that you deserved a place in the world. Ricardo hadn't just taken my legs and my friend. He had taken Mew. And that first night, to the sound of a woman crying somewhere in the dark, a muffled cry to not show weakness, I accepted my prison as my tomb. The silence, the sound of my life ending in the cell wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of my life ending. But what I saw in the mirror that night wasn't me anymore. It was the beginning of something else, something I couldn't yet name, something forged in cold and iron. The early years merged into a single, long gray blur. Time in prison, it doesn't pass. It accumulates. Time is the invisible enemy. Routine was the only thing that kept me sane, a fragile skeleton on which I hung the empty hours. Waking up at 5 a.m. to the clanking of keys, a sound that became my hellish alarm clock. The counting, where we had to be visible, our bodies just numbers on a spreadsheet. The breakfast that tasted like cardboard and the bitter coffee, which I drank only for the warmth in my hands. The day was filled with boredom, an oppressive wait for nothing. I saw the other women, their complex hierarchies, their cell families, the alliances formed and broken by a wrong word or a pack of cigarettes. They had a code, a way of surviving that involved a toughness I didn't possess. I, however, was an island, the posh assassin who had fallen from grace. Their pride was armor. Mine was a barrier. They saw me as an aberration, an educated woman who had destroyed her own life, and worse, a paralyzed woman who was a constant burden. They didn't openly antagonize me. My disability placed me in a strange category of untouchable. But their looks were a mixture of pity and contempt. "Don't step on my floor if you don't know the price," I heard a veteran say to a newbie, and I understood that I didn't know the price of anything there. I was a permanent visitor to a world whose rules I didn't understand, and my refusal to try to fit in was seen as arrogance. Mai los me isolava. I spent my days in the prison library, not in the hope of an appeal, but because books were a prison better than my cell. The smell of old paper and dust was the only aroma that brought me any comfort. I read about history, philosophy, quantum physics, anything that wasn't my life. I observed the old-timers, how they had adapted, how prison had become their home. They had found a way to do time, without letting time kill them. They made crafts, led Bible study groups, worked the laundry with fierce efficiency. They had found a purpose, even if it was just surviving another day. For me, time was punishment. Each sunrise, a cold, gray light filtered through the bars, was a reminder of my loss permanent. Betrayal Ricardo's had become a shield. I didn't trust anyone. The silence was my only company. I was becoming one of those figures I read about in history books. A hermit, a ghostly woman who haunted the halls in a wheelchair. A living reminder that justice, sometimes, is just a fancy word for successful revenge. I was disappearing. I was dying in a way no death sentence could execute. And honestly, part of me didn't mind disappearing. By 5th grade, I had hit bottom. Silence had become my skin. My cell, with its faded photos of my former life, Ricardo and I smiling on a boat, Clara and I toasting her birthday, was not a home, but a mausoleum. Thalos Clara's was a constant pain, but blame was my daily companion, a ghost that sat on the edge of my narrow bed. In the darkness of my memory, in that black hole, I had to have done it. Ricardo's evidence was irrefutable. I was the monster he said I was. Paralysis was my penance. I had destroyed my best friend's life, and the universe, in an act of justice poetic and terrible, had destroyed mine. The iron smell of the cell was like the smell of my own dried blood, a constant reminder of what I had done. Desperate for any kind of relief, anything that might break the echo of my own condemnation, I joined a prayer group that met in the chapel. The chapel was just another concrete room, but they tried. There was a plastic crucifix taped to the wall and worn Bibles with tear-stained pages. They were women who spoke of redemption and miracles with desperate conviction. They wept for their children lost to the system, confessed their addictions, their thefts, their moments of rage that lasted a few seconds but cost them decades. They sought forgiveness. God visited me in the hole, a woman with haunted eyes testified. He found me where no one else looked. They saw the faith as a survival tool, a window in the solid wall. I tried to pray with them. I tried to feel the presence they described. I tried to confess. But what could I say? I killed my best friend, but I don't remember. Faith that they felt like a locked window to me. My silence was not of reverence. It was of emptiness. They were asking for forgiveness for things they remembered. I was asking for forgiveness for an abyss. The forgiveness, theirs seemed attainable. Mine, impossible. I couldn't connect with a God who would allow such darkness, or who would create me capable of such an act. I was a spectator on their journey of redemption, and my presence there seemed like a mockery, a fraud. I accepted my fate. This was my justice. a broken body for a broken soul. I stopped fighting. I stopped feeling. The prison had won. I was a shell, a number in a morning count, just breathing out of habit. I was no longer doing time. I was simply waiting for the end. The silence was no longer a choice. It was all that remained. I had become the echo of a mistake that the world, and I myself, could not forgive. The worst cell was the one I had built myself, and I had swallowed the key. I was ready to give up. And it was precisely at that moment, at the lowest point of my existence, that the universe decided to send me a miracle in the form of a ghost. And then she came. A normal Tuesday, visiting day. The air was heavy with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant from the living room, a place I avoided. I wasn't expecting anyone. Ricardo never came, an absence that was, in itself, a constant and cold presence. My family, they believed in him, lost theirs was another cut in my long list of emotional amputations. The guard called me, her bored voice breaking my lethargy. Duarte, visitor. The sound of my name seemed strange. I rolled my chair down the hallway, the squeak of the wheels echoing, each turn a struggle against my own apathy. I assumed it was a lawyer by profession. Perhaps a clerical error, but the woman sitting behind the thick glass was not a lawyer. She was old, her face a map of fine lines, her age-stained hands clasped over the bag in her lap. She looked terrified, like a small bird that had wandered into a lion's cage. She sat across from me, her eyes filled with ancient fear and fragile determination. "You don't know me," she whispered into the phone, her voice shaking. "My name is Martha. I was head nurse at the hospital. That night, my heart, which I thought had turned to stone, gave a painful thud, an atrophied muscle forced to move. I just stared at her, unable to process. Silence between us was thick, full of ghosts from that night in the hospital. "I should have come sooner," she continued, glancing over her shoulder even though we were alone. "I was scared. Dr. Duarte, he was so powerful. He threatened my pension, threatened my son's job. The mention of Ricardo made the air in my lungs freeze. I kept this," she said, and her trembling hand slid a plain envelope through the worn slot under the glass. "For blame. I retired last month. I can't do it anymore. I can't find God with this in my soul." She was searching for her own redemption, and I was his final confession. I took the envelope. My hands were numb. I opened the envelope right then and there, my clumsy fingers tearing through the paper. Inside, a short letter, and taped to it, a tiny memory card. "It's from Clara's cell phone," Martha said, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. "It was in her pocket when they brought her in. Dr. Duarte ordered her personal belongings destroyed. He said it was tainted evidence. I kept it. Miracle. A word I had forgotten. A word that seemed obscene within those walls." Martha stood, a ghost searching for her own freedom. "I'm sorry," she said, and walked out, almost running, leaving me there with the only thing more dangerous than true. The proof. I hid the card in my hand, the small plastic burning my skin. The prison around me suddenly felt electric. The silence. It was no longer about the past. It was about what was about to happen. The risk was everything. The prize in He has eyes everywhere. An invisible network of informants and bored guards looking for anything to break the monotony. The memory card was a burning lump of coal in my hand. I hid it in the only place I had absolute privacy, under the worn insole of my shoe, a space my numb body couldn't betray. One surprise, inspection, one random search, and all would be lost. Loss of this little piece of plastic would be the loss of my only chance. The end of True before she could breathe. The silence from my cell at night was no longer about blame. It was about fear. A new, electric fear that made me feel alive for the first time in 5 years. I needed privacy, a computer. And there was only one place. The library. I was a model prisoner, a harmless ghost in a wheelchair. Boredom and silence made me trustworthy. I had privileges at the library, an ancient beige computer used for basic legal research, a dinosaur from a bygone era. The library guard was lazy, a woman named Davis, who spent most of her shift more interested in her phone than in a woman paralyzed by legal statutes. The smell of old paper and dust was comforting, but my heart beat to the rhythm of a war drum. I waited for weeks. Patience is the first lesson a prison teaches you. Waiting for the right moment, the perfect distraction. Finally, it came. A fight broke out in the cafeteria during lunchtime. A high-pitched scream followed by the sound of metal trays hitting the floor. Davis sighed, put down his phone, and went to check the alarm, locking the library from the outside but leaving me inside. I was alone. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely insert the card into the USB drive. The wheelchair seemed to scream in the silence of the empty room. The drive light blinked. A small orange heartbeat. One file. Just one. Audio. I plugged in the library's old headphones, the cracked plastic cold against my ear. I clicked, and Thessalence was broken forever. Clara's voice, panicked, breathless. "Ricardo, stop. What are you doing?" "Oh my God, Ricardo, he's here. He has the papers." And then, Richard's voice. Not the soft, mournful voice of the court. It was a cold, cutting voice, filled with controlled fury. "You shouldn't have interfered, Clara. You and your little investigation." There was a thud, a short, muffled scream, the sound of something, or someone, falling. And then, silence. It wasn't a fight between friends. It was an execution. Clara was investigating, and the thud I thought was her. I realized, with a horror that froze my blood. The thud was Shay. And the second sound. A crash. A noise of something heavy rolling. That was Sue. A betrayal. It wasn't just him accusing me. The loss. It wasn't just Clara. The paralysis. The paralysis was intentional. He pushed me too. He silenced me in the most permanent way. The prison. It was just the second box he put me in. I rolled my chair out of the library, my mind a whirl. Officer Davis returned, complaining about the chaos in the cafeteria, barely glancing at me. I was invisible, just as he'd planned. The gray cell that had once been my tomb now felt like a cocoon. Silence. That night was no longer penance. It was a weapon. It was the place where I could think, where the white noise of my blame had finally stopped. The prison hadn't broken me. She had forged me. The smell of iron was no longer the smell of loss, it was the smell of my anger. I replayed the audio in my mind, over and over, every inflection, every background sound. Clara's little investigation. The papers. Ricardo wasn't a grieving husband. He was a calculating criminal who had executed my best friend in cold blood. He didn't just frame me. He neutralized. He needed me alive, but discredited. A grieving widow, paralyzed by grief. Sympathy. The world could question, could seek other answers. But a crazed murderess, paralyzed by her crime. Tragic poetry. Justice. He turned me into my own prison before he even threw me into one. He turned me into a symbol of his pain and built his career on my tragedy. The district attorney, so dedicated he was willing to arrest his own wife. The hero. Betrayal was so deep, so Machiavellian, that it took my breath away. He didn't just steal my freedom. He stole my identity, my memory, and my body. A blame that consumed me for 5 years evaporated. It didn't diminish. It vanished, as if it had never existed, leaving behind a cold, crystalline fury. The faith that I was looking for in the chapel. I found it, not in a merciful God, but in the raw, ugly truth of that recording. This was no longer about freedom. I would never walk again. This loss was permanent. This wasn't about clearing my name to a world that had forgotten me. This was about justice. Justice real. Primitive. That kind of justice that burns everything to the ground. The redemption what I sought was not for my soul. It was for Clara's memory. I owed her that. I owed her the truth for which she was murdered. And that's when I realized. The greatest weapon Ricardo had used against me was now my greatest advantage. My paralysis. My wheelchair. My cripple in a box status. No one suspects a broken woman. No one sees the sharp mind behind her empty eyes. He had made me invisible to the world, and now, from that invisibility, I would attack him. Prison was no longer my sentence. It was my training ground. The silence. It was no longer my defeat. It was my camouflage. The game had changed. I was no longer a piece on his board. I was the opposing player. I was trapped. A sharp mind locked in a broken body, locked in a concrete box. The audio was safe, copied from the library to the tiny memory card, and the card was back in its hiding place, under the sole of my shoe. But true, without a messenger, it is just a secret. The prison was designed to sever connections. The walls weren't just made of cement. They were made of rules, surveillance, and fear. I needed hands on the outside world. I needed Martha. Frustration was a metallic taste in my mouth, the taste of the iron in my cell. I couldn't call her. All the calls from Prisonar recorded, monitored. One wrong word, and Ricardo, with his tentacles throughout the entire system justice, would know I was waking up. I used my only phone call of the week, not to speak to a relative who abandoned me, but to contact a free legal aid service I'd always ignored. I didn't ask for a lawyer. I didn't ask for an appeal. I gave them a name and a mission. The voice on the other end was tired, overwhelmed. "Ma'am, we handle appeals, not personal messages." I interrupted her, my voice low and urgent. "This is a matter of life and death. It's evidence in a murder case." That got her attention. "Find Martha Jenkins. She's a retired nurse from St. Jude Hospital. Please find her. Just tell her this. The lilies were a lie." There was assailants heavy on the phone. The paralegal probably thought I was crazy, another delusional inmate. But she wrote it down. The lilies, it was a lie. Okay. The click of the call ending was deafening. Now, the worst part of any plan. The waiting. The next few days were the purest form of torture. The routine of prison, which had once been a numbing anesthetic, was now agony. The sound of the keys, the counting, the food that tasted like punishment. Everything was an obstacle, a dead time between me and the justice. I went over the plan again and again. What if Martha got scared? What if Ricardo found her first? Faith. It's not something you have. It's something you exert. And mine was being stretched to the breaking point. A week later, I was called into the visiting room. It wasn't visiting day. My heart pounded against my ribs. It was the same free aid attorney, a young man with a cheap suit and tired eyes. He sat down and opened a folder, avoiding my gaze. "Mrs. Duarte, I did what you asked. It was irregular, but I found Martha Jenkins." He looked confused, like a man who'd stumbled upon a conspiracy he didn't understand. "She was very scared, but she gave me a message for you." He looked down at his notes, as if he didn't believe them. She said to tell you she's ready to tend the garden." A wave of relief so strong hit me I almost felt dizzy. The garden, where lying lilies wouldn't grow. The alliance was sealed. Martha, consumed by blame and seeking their own redemption, would be my hands. The young lawyer looked at me. "I don't know what's going on here, Mrs. Duarte, but this seems dangerous." I looked at him. The first time I'd met someone's gaze with real strength in 5 years. "Aperson has already taken from me everything I could afford to lose," I said. "Danger doesn't scare me anymore." He closed the folder, a new respect in his eyes. Betrayal. The weapon that Richard had used to destroy me had inadvertently forged the weapons that would destroy him. I had my soldier. Now I needed a battle plan. The plan began to form. We couldn't simply leak the audio. I knew Ricardo. He was the district attorney. He controlled the narrative. He would bury the story, destroy Martha's credibility as a senile, vengeful nurse, paint me as a manipulative liar, a desperate killer willing to do anything. True, raw wasn't enough against a master of legal fiction. No, I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to make him give himself up, make him hang himself with his own rope, justice that he so pretended to defend. I needed more than a recording. I needed the context that Clara had died to protect, the papers she mentioned. The library became my arsenal. The smell of old paper and dust was the smell of strategy. I stopped reading philosophy and started reading law books. Precedents, procedural misconduct, fraud, corruption. I was no longer Helena the physiotherapist, the paralyzed victim. I was a general in a besieged fortress. My mind, sharpened by silence and with focused rage, he devoured the texts. The prison gave me something Ricardo never had: unlimited time and nothing to lose. While I studied the law, Martha, my ghost soldier, studied. She was the invisible elderly woman no one noticed in public records, in cafes near the courthouse. She fed me information through our secure channel, the young pro bono lawyer, who was now reluctantly but firmly on our side. Martha discovered what Clara was investigating. Ricardo was embezzling funds, millions, drug forfeiture money, protected witness funds. He was laundering money through shell companies. Clara, a forensic accountant, a detail Ricardo conveniently omitted at trial, had found the trail. She confronted him, not as an accuser, but as a concerned friend, and he silenced her. And Ricardo's rise? It was meteoric. He was running for state attorney general. His platform? Unyielding justice. He was using my story, Thelos' tragic story of his first life, as his political springboard, his moral alibi. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. He used the law to create the lie. I would use the true to create justice. And then, I found it. Amidst thousands of pages of transcripts from my own trial, a loose thread. A document I'd read hundreds of times in my haze of blame. But now, with clear eyes, it screamed at me. A motion to suppress evidence that my lawyer never contested. A cell phone report that Ricardo claimed was corrupted and therefore irrelevant. The cell phone report of Clara. He did not destroy it. He hid it in plain sight, trusting that no one would ever look for it, trusting that the loss of my credibility would make any appeal impossible. That report was the key. It wasn't enough to free me, but it was enough to pull the thread and make his entire carefully constructed world crumble. I had the end of the rope. Now I needed someone inside prison to help me pull it. A prison has its own rules, and information is the most valuable currency. I needed an inside ally, someone who understood the unseen mechanics of this place. There was a woman in my wing, a lifer, everyone called Scribe. She'd been there for 20 years, a quiet, observant woman who, for some reason, everyone respected. She wasn't a gang leader, she wasn't violent. Her power was different. She seemed to understand prison, not as a punishment, but as an ecosystem. She was the center of the kiting network. The smuggled messages, notes passed on bars of soap, hidden in the hems of uniforms. If you needed anything, Scribe was the gateway. She was the silent mentor of Pod 3B, the embodiment of survival. I approached her cautiously. She spent hours in the library, not reading, but writing in a notebook with tiny handwriting. I watched her for days. I noticed the way she held her pencil. Her fingers twisted. Her hands were gnarled, the fingers deformed by debilitating arthritis. The cold, damp air of the prison, the smell of mold and iron, must have been torture for her joints. Here was my coin. Here was my chance to treat her like a person. I approached her not with a request, but with an offer. I rolled my chair up to her desk one day. She didn't look up. "Excuse me," I said softly. "I was a physical therapist. I can help you with your hands, if you'll let me." For the first time in 5 years, she looked up from her notebook, silence stretched out. His eyes were sunken, and they did not see a cripple. They saw Helena Duarte. She was measuring me. "Why?" Her voice was hoarse from disuse. "Because I know what it's like to live with pain in a body that won't obey," I said. She reached out. For weeks, it became our ritual. In the corner of the library, away from the guard's eyes, I worked on her hands. I taught her stretching exercises, massage techniques to ease the pain. I asked for nothing in return. I treated the human, not the prisoner. We spoke little, but it was a communion. It was the prison sisterhood I'd never been a part of. A prison family of 2. She was the veteran, and I, in a strange way, was healing my healer. Prison had taken away the use of my legs, but my hands still had a purpose. I was finding my redemption not in the chapel under a plastic crucifix, but in that act of care. The faith that I lost was replaced by something more tangible, the solidarity between women that the world had discarded. One night, as I worked on her gnarled hands, she finally asked, her voice low, "What do you want, Duarte?" She stopped writing and stared at me, her gaze piercing. "No one here does anything for free." I stopped massaging. "They broke you," she continued. "But you're not broken. You're waiting." I took a deep breath. The smell of dust and old paper felt sacred. "I need a message. Out, without a trace. For my lawyer. A message that can't be heard, read, or traced." Scribe studied me with eyes that had seen everything. "Here," I said, echoing the words I'd heard on my first day. "We do what we have to do to keep from going crazy." She gave a slight smile, the first I'd seen, breaking the mask of her reputation. "You learn quickly." She gripped her pencil, now more firmly. "Tell me what to write." The inner alliance was forged. Justice was just a step away. Oh my God, prison seemed more rarefied. The risk was palpable. One wrong move and I would be in the hole, in isolation, my connection to Martha and Scribe cut off forever. The silence of my cell was now filled with planning. I was a mind racing at high speed, while my body remained still. Thelos, my mobility, was my best camouflage. No one suspects a broken woman. I wrote the message to Scribe on a tiny piece of Bible paper, the ink from the smuggled ballpoint pen seeming to bleed onto the thin page. It wasn't a confession, nor an accusation. It was a key. "Attorney," I wrote, "inform Martha. The garden needs fertilizer. Motion to suppress 719B, Clara's cell phone report. The prosecutor lied. He wasn't corrupt. He was in hiding." Scribe took the small paper, folded it into a tiny square, and swallowed it. "It takes 12 hours, she said, her voice matter of fact. "Be ready. Faith that I placed in that woman was more real than any prayer I had ever prayed. The prison, it operates on a system of trust older than any written law." The message went from one hand to another, hidden in a bar of soap, exchanged in the laundry line, until it reached the pro bono attorney during his next visit to another inmate. He, in turn, passed it to Martha. Alliance worked like a silent machine, driven by blame of one and by revenge of the other. Now, it was Martha's turn. Through Scribe, I gave Martha the second instruction. It was time to plant the seed. She wasn't to go to the police. The police belonged to Ricardo. She would use a prepaid phone and an anonymous email address, created at a public library. The message would be sent not to the largest newspaper, but to a local investigative reporter, a woman named Anya Sharma, known for her tenacity and her open hatred of Ricardo Duarte's office, which had sued her for slander and lost. She was a pit bull looking for a fight. The message was short and cryptic. Ricardo Duarte tampered with evidence in the Duarte case. Check motion to suppress 719B. Clara's cell phone report was not corrupted. It was hidden. Follow the money Clara was following. We waited. It was the longest week of my life. Silence. It was deafening. Every key in the hallway made me jump. Every guard call was a potential death sentence. And then it happened. It wasn't an explosion. It was a whisper. A small article on an online investigative blog, Anya Sharma's blog, buried beneath larger stories. The title was, "Procedural Issues Raise Questions About Duarte's Old Conviction." It was nothing, but it was all. It was the first scratch on Richard's impeccable armor. The betrayal, buried for 5 years, was beginning to stink. The prison, the entire room seemed to be holding its breath with me. And then I knew he had seen it. Guard Davis, usually bored, was nervous. Cell inspections became more frequent. Ricardo was scared, and he was coming to see me. He came. The scent of his expensive sandalwood perfume filled the living room, a sickly contrast to the musty, desperate odor of the prison. It was a fragrance that I associated with home, to dinners, to security. Now it smelled like betrayal. Ricardo hadn't visited me in 3 years. He didn't come as a husband. He came as a predator sensing a threat to his territory. His face was thinner, his eyes bloodshot. His usual arrogance had been replaced by an electric tension. He dismissed the guard with a brusque wave. The door closed, leaving us in a silence charged. He leaned over the table, his fury a physical thing, vibrating in the cold air. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice low and lethal. It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation. He was used to being in control, asking the questions. I stared at him. The woman who cried on his shoulder in the hospital was gone. The woman who accepted his blame was dead. The woman before him was something forged in the fires of betrayal and cooled in the steel of prison. I kept my hands clasped in my lap, my calm a deliberate provocation. "I don't know what you're talking about, Ricardo." Thelos from my memory, remember? I used his own weapon against him, the weakness he had created. He slammed it on the table, a dull sound that made the plastic phone jump. "Don't mess with me, Helena. That blog, that reporter. It has your fingerprints all over it." "What did you tell her?" I stared at him, letting the silence stretch. The silence was my cell, and now it was my weapon. I let him marinate in his own panic. "I've been reading, Ricardo." My voice was calm, even, the opposite of his fury. "Here in the library, about the law, about justice." He sneered, an ugly sound, but his eyes were frightened. "Justice? You talking about justice? You are nothing," he spat. "You're a murderer. You're a cripple in a box. You have nothing." That's when I smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was a small, slow, heartfelt smile. The power in the room shifted so fast he nearly choked. The predator recoiled, confused. "You're right," I said softly. "I am. I'm nothing but a broken woman in a cell. But you're a decorated man running for attorney general. You're the face of justice in the state. And here you are, terrified, of a cripple in a box." His control mask cracked. The blood drained from his face. He didn't know what I had, but he knew, at that moment, that I had something. "What do you want, Helena?" he asked, his voice now a whisper. "Money? A transfer to a prison better?" I almost laughed. He still thought he could buy the forgiveness. "I want the redemption, Clara," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper as lethal as his had been. "I want you to feel what I felt. The loss of everything. I want you to look at the mirror and look what I see. A monster." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping on the floor. "You're signing your death warrant," he threatened. But it was an empty bluff. Thelos, the sight of his control was the most beautiful I'd seen in 5 years. "I'm already dead, Ricardo," I replied. "You killed me on that staircase. All you did was give me a quiet place to plan your funeral." He looked at me, his face a mask of hatred and fear, and left, slamming the door. The scent of his perfume lingered, but now it smelled of fear. The seed wasn't just planted, it was sprouting, and he had just watered it with his panic. Ricardo's panic was a wave that reverberated even within the walls of the prison. The guards were tense. The warden, a woman I barely saw, now passed through the medical wing daily, her eyes lingering on my cell. There was a surprise inspection, not the routine search for contraband, but a methodical and desperate destruction. 4 guards, not the usual 2, turned everything over. They ripped open my mattress, threw my few books on the floor, and smashed the photos of Clara and Ricardo I kept in my mirror of steel. They were searching for something, a device, a diary, anything. The smell of fear was stronger than the smell of disinfectant, but they didn't know what to look for. True wasn't hidden under my mattress. She was in my head and, thanks to Martha, safe from the outside world. They found nothing, but the message was clear. Ricardo was hunting me. The reporter, Anya Sharma, smelling blood in the water, was digging. Her short blog post had been followed by a bolder one, questioning the handling of funds in the district attorney's office. Ricardo was making mistakes, trying to cover his financial tracks, but only creating more smoke, drawing more attention to the fire that Clara had lit. Thessalence, that he used to bury me, was now suffocating him. He was trapped in his own web of lies, and every move he made to free himself only entangled him further. The man who controlled the justice was being consumed by it. It was time. The time for strategy was over. It was time for checkmate. Prison.I was on high alert. Guard Davis had been replaced in the library by a stern male guard who watched me every second. My communication with Scribe was cut off. Ricardo thought he had isolated me, but he was reacting too late. The final plan was already in motion. I had given Scribe the final message weeks earlier, the order that would only be executed if I was placed in the hole, or if Ricardo came to see me. His visit was the trigger. Scribe had obtained my message to Martha. Now, send everything. Martha, in her final act of redemption, didn't just send the audio. She sent the whole package. Clara's audio recording, digitally authenticated by an expert the pro bono lawyer found. Clara's bank statements, proving the embezzlement. And most importantly, a video confession from Martha herself, detailing the night in the hospital, Ricardo's threat, and her 5 years of silence and blame. It was a complete narrative, a story of betrayal, murder, and corruption that could not be denied. The package wasn't just for the reporter. It was for Ricardo's rival in the race for Attorney General. It was for the governor, and it was for the chief of the state police. The explosion was nuclear. That night, the common room TV, usually tuned to cheap soap operas, was on the news. The sound was low, but I could see it. Ricardo's face, the word research, Clara's photo, and then my photo. Not the trial photo, but an old photo from before when I was smiling. The common room was in a state of utter amazement. Silence. All the women, the murderers, the addicts, the thieves, they all looked from the TV to me, sitting in the back of the room in my wheelchair. The miraclet wasn't divine intervention. It was the courage of 3 broken women, who the world had decided were invisible. In that moment, in the midst of my prison, surrounded by criminals, I never felt so free. Daryl's cell was his, and it was finally closing. My last morning in the cell. The same smell of disinfectant and stale coffee, the same sound of keys in the hallway at 5 a.m. But this time, they weren't the sound of my prison, were the sound of my freedom. The prison warden, the same woman who had coldly prosecuted me 5 years earlier, came in person. She was uncomfortable, her eyes not meeting mine. I was no longer inmate 88204. I was Mrs. Helena Duarte, the greatest disgrace to the prison system. Justice of the state. Mrs. Duarte, she said, the formality strange in her mouth. Your belongings, you are released. She opened the cell door. The creak, which for 5 years had been the sound of my confinement, was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I rolled my chair out, past the now empty cell. Scribe stood in the doorway of his own cell, watching me insolence. A prison. The entire place was quiet, a rare break in the usual cacophony. The women watched me through their bars, their faces a mixture of curiosity and perhaps a glimmer of hope. I stopped my chair in front of Scribe. She didn't smile, but gave me a single, slow nod. The respect of this lifer, this woman who had seen it all, meant more to me than any order to release her. Use your hands, Duarte, she murmured, her own redemption found in our alliance. I nodded. Keep writing, Scribe. They led me down the long green corridors, the sound of my wheels echoing. Each metal door that opened for me sounded like thunder. The final gate slid aside, a heavy sound of metal on metal, the most final sound of my life, louder than the judge's gavel, more final than the whisper of betrayal of Ricardo. And then, the outdoors, Thessalon's. The sound of the outside world was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the wind. The sun on my face felt strange, warm, something I'd only felt through the dirty glass. I was outside. And Martha was there, outside the main gate, her face wet with tears, her hands wringing a handkerchief. I rolled over to her, my chair struggling against the uneven gravel. She was shaking. Helena. I'm so sorry. I stopped my chair and took her trembling hand. My hands. The hands of a healer. The hands that had helped Scribe. Now comforted the woman who had saved me. Thank you for my freedom, I said. Martha shook her head, squeezing my hand as if I were her anchor. No, she whispered, her voice broken by the blame. Thank you for mine. And there, at the gate of prison, 2 women found their forgiveness. I looked at the car waiting for me, and then at my motionless legs in my chair. The justice had been served. Ricardo was in jail, awaiting a trial that was a mere formality. He was discovering what a cell smelled like and the sound of doors locking. But the loss was permanent. I was free from prison of concrete. More to prison of my body would remain. And the betrayal. A betrayal left scars that no court could heal. I survived. Now, I had to figure out how to live. Sometimes the justice does not come in the form of a judge's gavel. It comes in the silence of a truth kept for a long time. My prize in it wasn't the bars. It was the lie I was forced to believe. They took my legs, but they gave me a steel spine. If you've ever felt trapped, by someone else's judgment, by a loss that seemed to define you, or at least silence of your own pain, this story is yours too. The real one redemption. It's not about forgetting. It's about surviving. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that even in the darkest cell, faith that true could be the key that opens the door.